I watched the family group chat like a man watching a slow train leave the station. The messages came in warm threads of plans and jokes about Christmas. Photos of lights, recipes, and cozy tables kept popping up. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to say I would come. I wanted to be invited, but the little bubble beside my name stayed quiet. I told myself not to let it hurt. I told myself family could be messy. Still, I read the messages again. I live small. My workshop is a shed behind a narrow house. I make toys and fix things with my hands. People call what I do carpentry, but to me it is more like speaking in wood. I work with patience and prayer. My hands know the feeling of sand and varnish. I save money and give what I can. Mostly I give time. I make a wooden angel for the children's orphanage every December. They like how it smiles. That day I sat at a little table with my phone and a cup of cold coffee. The laughter in the group felt far away. I told myself to go to bed early. I tried to sleep, but my stomach was tight. I decided to call my father. His name said father in my mind, not dad or pop. He picks up after 3 rings. His voice sounded like the houses he used to build, flat and steady. He spoke first, and I thought he wanted to ask about the clocks I repair. But his words cut clean. "You're too poor to host Christmas," he said. Wouldn't feel right. I laughed because I thought he was joking. We both studied silence. The call ended. I put the phone down. The laughter in the chat kept going, but it sounded like another life. I walked into my workshop and touched the angel I had been sanding. My hands trembled not from the work, but from a hollow ache. That night, I promised myself I would build something my father and the world could ignore. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The sound of rain on the tin roof mixed with the creak of my old chair. I tried to keep my thoughts quiet, but my father's words replayed over and over. "You're too poor to host Christmas." It wasn't the first time he'd said something sharp, but this one dug deeper. I told myself not to cry. Men in my family don't cry. At least that's what he always said. I went back to my workshop and turned on the radio. The soft hum of old carols filled the room. I sanded the wings of the wooden angel again, tracing every curve like I was touching hope itself. That's when I saw it. A small, faded photo pinned to the corner of my workbench. Me and my father, years ago, both smiling proudly beside a toy horse we built together. I remember that day. He told me, "Hands that build never stay empty." I believed him then. I sat there staring at that picture for a long time. Maybe he had forgotten what he once taught me. Maybe the world had changed him. I whispered to the picture, "One day I'll build something you'll never forget." My words sounded foolish in the small workshop, but they gave me something to hold on to. Just as I began packing up, my phone buzzed again, an unknown number. I hesitated, but answered. A soft, old voice came through, shaky but kind. "Are you the carpenter who made the angel for the orphanage?" "Yes, sir," I said slowly. "I need something built," he said. "Can you build a house that feels like love?" I didn't understand what he meant, but his tone made me say yes before thinking. He said he'd come by tomorrow. I hung up and looked around my workshop, heart racing. A stranger's request had just walked into my life, and somehow I felt my story was about to change forever. Please subscribe and share for more interesting true life stories. The next day, the stranger arrived just as the morning fog began to lift. He was an elderly man dressed in a worn brown coat and a hat that had seen many winters. His shoes were muddy, and yet he carried himself with quiet dignity, like someone who had known both wealth and loss. He smiled as soon as he saw me. "You must be Eli," he said. His voice carried a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm Alaric. I've heard about your work. They say you build things that feel alive." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and showed him inside. The smell of sawdust filled the air, and the morning light cut across the wood like gold. He studied the half-finished angel on my bench, his eyes softening. "You have gentle hands," he murmured. "What kind of house did you want built?" I asked. He took out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and spread it across the table. It was a rough sketch of a small home. But it wasn't just any house. It had curved beams shaped like open arms, windows that faced the sunrise, and a single large heart carved at the center beam. "A house that feels like love," he repeated. His request sounded strange, but something inside me stirred. Maybe it was the sadness in his eyes, or Maybe it was the way he looked at my workshop like it was sacred. We talked for hours about design, wood types, and purpose. I could tell he wasn't rich, but he insisted on paying double my usual rate. When I told him I didn't need that much, he simply smiled. "You'll understand one day, son." That night, after he left, I stood alone by my workbench. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt like the start of something meant to heal me. The following week, Alaric returned with blueprints in hand. We sat under the dim light of my workshop as he showed me his design in greater detail. The structure was simple, but his ideas were full of emotion. "Every corner should carry kindness," he said. "A home should breathe compassion." He spoke with such conviction that I found myself listening like a student to a wise teacher. "The foundation of a home isn't concrete," he continued. "It's compassion." I wrote his words down in my notebook. We spent hours sketching, redrawing, and adjusting every small detail. I suggested using cedar for warmth and oak for strength. He nodded approvingly, saying, "Cedar for heart, oak for courage. Perfect." During breaks, we shared tea and stories. He told me about his travels, the people he'd met, and the lessons he'd learned about kindness. But when I asked about his family, he grew quiet. His eyes went far away, as though he was staring into a place time couldn't reach. "Some things," he said softly, "you carry alone." When the day ended, he looked around my workshop again. "This place is small," he said gently, "but it holds something big, something most people never find." After he left, I worked late into the night, redrawing every measurement. I didn't understand why, but I wanted to make this project perfect. Maybe it was because his dream reminded me of my own, to build something that mattered. The next morning, I received an envelope at my doorstep. Inside was the full payment, double the agreed amount, and a short note. "Begin. I'll return soon." But Alaric never came back. At first, I thought something had happened to him. I waited a week, then 2, asking around town if anyone had seen him. No one had. Finally, one cold morning, I found a small wooden box placed outside my workshop door. Inside was a letter sealed with red wax and a small, carved wooden key. The letter read, "This key opens your future. Keep building." My heart raced as I turned the key over in my palm. It had a symbol carved into it, a heart surrounded by tiny rays like sunlight. I had never seen anything like it before. Days passed, and though I didn't know where Alaric had gone, I continued working on the model house we had designed. Every cut, every nail, every smooth curve reminded me of his words. The foundation of a home is compassion. Something about the work felt sacred. I began giving small pieces of furniture to families in need, free of charge. A widow cried when I repaired her table. A single father hugged me after I built his child a crib. Those moments filled the empty places my father's rejection had left behind. Still, at night, I wondered about Alaric. His words, his wisdom, his sudden disappearance. It all felt like a story I was meant to finish. One afternoon, as I was closing shop, a silver car pulled up outside. A woman in a navy coat stepped out, holding a clipboard. "Are you Eli Ward?" she asked. "Yes," I said carefully. "I'm a real estate agent," she explained. "We're looking for skilled carpenters for high-end projects. Would you be interested?" Before I could answer, she glanced down at my workbench and froze. "Where did you get that blueprint?" she asked, her voice suddenly tense. I looked at Alaric's design and realized this was no ordinary project. I told her the truth, that an old man named Alaric Boone had given it to me. Her eyes widened, as if the name had meaning she wasn't ready to share. She didn't press further, only said, "If you ever want bigger work, come my office. We could use someone with your touch." The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I went to her office downtown. The building gleamed with glass and marble, a far cry from my wooden workshop. Her name was Clara Hughes, and she introduced me to a group of designers and developers. They studied my hands like I was a puzzle. After reviewing my sketches, the company offered me a contract. I was to help design interiors for several luxury homes. It felt unreal. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was building a future. Weeks passed. I poured my heart into every project, using Alaric's philosophy of warmth and compassion. The homes I designed felt alive. Soon, people started talking about the carpenter who made houses feel like love. Still, every paycheck arrived with a note: keep building. The world needs more hearts like yours. No signature, no explanation. But the handwriting, it looked just like Alaric's. As my workshop expanded and business grew, my family began to notice. My siblings teased me about my sawdust dreams, but I didn't mind. What mattered was the work. Then one day, Clara pulled me aside. You should know, she said, the company's owner, your main investor, never shows his face. He only asks for one thing: that you keep designing with heart. A chill ran down my spine. Somehow, I knew this was Alaric's doing. But how? And why me? The mystery of his key and his words had only begun to unfold. Months passed like pages turning too quickly. My business grew faster than I could have imagined. I hired 2 apprentices and expanded my workshop into a proper studio. The Heartwood design sign I carved by hand gleamed proudly above the door. Still, my heart carried a quiet ache, the kind that success can't silence. My family rarely called. My father still saw me as the poor son, the one who made toys while his brothers and sisters became real professionals. When Christmas came again, I decided to visit home. I crafted a gift for my father, a handmade wooden clock, carved with care and gold-trimmed edges. It wasn't just a clock. It was a piece of my heart. Dinner that night was stiff and cold. My siblings laughed about their new cars, promotions, and vacations. When I handed the clock to my father, his expression didn't change. He turned it in his hands and said flatly, "You can't buy time, son, especially when you've wasted yours." The laughter around the table froze. I smiled weakly and said, "It's all right." After dinner, as I stood to leave, one of my brothers joked, "Maybe he'll Uber home in his sawdust truck." Everyone chuckled. I stepped outside into the cold air and took a deep breath. The stars above were bright, almost blinding. I whispered to the sky, "One day, I'll show them what faith builds." When I reached home, another envelope was waiting at my door. Inside was a deed to a piece of land in a quiet rural valley. There was no sender, only the same carved heart symbol that matched my wooden key. I didn't know what to think, but something deep inside told me this was the beginning of the answer I'd been waiting for. I drove out to see the land a few days later. The road wound through tall pine trees until it opened to a wide, sunlit valley. A gentle stream ran across it, and birds moved through the morning mist. The air smelled of pine and possibility. The land was breathtaking, untouched, peaceful, waiting for something to rise from it. I held the deed tightly in my hand and thought of Alaric. Was this his doing? I didn't have much money saved, but I knew one thing for sure. I wanted to build here. Not for profit, not for pride, but for purpose. Over the next few weeks, I began sketching ideas. A place where children without homes could live and learn trades. A place for widows and struggling families to rebuild their lives. I called it the Heartwood Foundation. It sounded impossible. My siblings laughed when they heard. "Still playing poor man charity?" one of them said. I just smiled. They didn't understand. I poured every savings, every ounce of strength into that land. Local volunteers helped me clear trees and lay the first beams. The work was hard, but filled me with peace. Months later, the first home stood, small, sturdy, filled with light. Families began moving in. Reporters came, taking photos and asking about my miracle project. I told them, "It's not mine, it's everyone's." Then one evening, a lawyer showed up at my door. "Mr. Eli Ward?" he asked. I nodded. He handed me a sealed envelope stamped with a name I hadn't heard in months, Alaric Boone. "This," he said, "is the last will and testament of one Mr. Boone, and it names you, sir, as the sole heir." My hands trembled. The mystery that began with a wooden key was far from over. The lawyer's words echoed in my small workshop long after he left. The last will and testament of Alaric Boone. I didn't understand why a man I barely knew would leave me anything, let alone an estate. Days passed, and the mystery grew heavier. I kept working at the Heartwood Foundation, pouring myself into every nail and board, but my thoughts circled back to that envelope on my workbench. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a simple line. Go to the address below. Everything will make sense. The address led me to the city's edge, to a mansion covered in ivy and silence. The air around it felt thick with stories. The gate bore a crest, a carved heart with rays, exactly like the one on my wooden key. My chest tightened. The lawyer confirmed it. This is the Boone estate. It's yours now, Mr. Ward. I could barely speak. I hadn't earned something so grand. But as I walked through its cracked doors, I realized it wasn't about wealth. It was about something deeper, legacy. Inside, the mansion was falling apart. Dust lay on everything, but it still held a strange grace. I saw empty frames, old furniture, and a piano missing keys. I could almost hear echoes of laughter that once lived there. I decided then and there I would rebuild it. Not for me, but for what it could mean to others. The next day, I returned home and told Clara I was leaving the luxury contracts. I have something new to build, I said. She stared at me for a long time, then nodded. Go build it, Eli. Some dreams are worth the risk. That night, as I stood under the stars holding that wooden key, I whispered, All right, Alaric. I'll finish what you started. And I meant it. Work on the estate began quietly. I used my own savings first, then the small donations from people who believed in what Heartwood stood for. The mansion was large and broken, but to me it felt like a sleeping giant waiting to wake. Each morning, I walked through the dusty halls and could almost feel Alaric's presence guiding me. Sometimes I'd stop by the grand fireplace and say softly, I'm still building, old friend. Soon, more workers came. Many of them were the same people who had learned trades through my foundation. Carpenters, painters, and masons. They didn't ask for much pay. They just wanted to help. Together, we began restoring the mansion room by room. The process was slow but beautiful. We found hidden carvings under old paint, secret passageways, and symbols of hearts engraved in beams. I kept wondering who Alaric really was, and why he had chosen me. While work continued, my family heard whispers of my crazy project. My brother texted once, joking that I was building fairy tales in the forest. I didn't reply. I'd learned by then that some dreams aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be lived. Months later, the mansion stood proud again, its windows shining in the sun like forgiveness itself. Reporters began visiting, calling it the Mansion of Hearts. People said it felt different, warmer, kinder, as though love had been built into its walls. And then, out of nowhere, another letter arrived. It had no return address, only the familiar handwriting. Keep building. The world still needs more hearts like yours. The same message, the same tone. I felt my chest tighten. Could Alaric still be alive? Or was someone else carrying his legacy? Either way, I knew this was only the beginning. When my father heard the news about the mansion, he called me for the first time in months. His voice carried the same old distance. I see your name in the papers now, he said. You're finally doing something real. I wanted to tell him that I'd always been doing something real, just not something he understood. But I stayed quiet. He invited me to a family dinner that weekend. I went, carrying no expectations, only a small wooden box. Inside, it was a gift, the same clock I'd made him before, repaired and polished, ticking perfectly this time. Dinner began with laughter, not mine, but theirs. They spoke about their jobs, cars, and trips. I smiled politely, waiting for my turn, but it never came. Finally, I placed a box in front of my father. I fix it for you, I said. He opened it slowly, glanced at the clock, then said, You can't buy time, son, especially when you've wasted yours. My chest tightened, but I only nodded. You're right, I whispered. That's why I built it. The table went silent. I stood up quietly and excused myself. My siblings exchanged glances. One muttered, He'll never change. Outside, I looked up at the night sky. The same stars that watched me struggle now watched me rise. As I drove home, I thought about Alaric again. He had believed in me when my own blood did not. And somehow, through him, I had found a purpose bigger than pain. When I got home, the wooden key caught the moonlight from my window. It glowed faintly, as if it still had more to reveal. I knew I wasn't done building. Not yet. Weeks after that painful dinner, I received a brown envelope in the mail. No name, no return address. Inside was a legal document, a deed to land in a rural valley. My heart stopped when I saw the carved crest on the corner, the same symbol as my wooden key. There was no note this time, only coordinates. I drove there the next day. The valley was silent and wide, the kind of place where the world feels new. Birds crossed the sky like brushstrokes, and the air smelled like rain and pine. I knelt, running my hands over the soil. It was mine, or rather, it was given. I could feel it deep inside. This was where something greater was meant to rise. Not another mansion, but a place where broken people could find peace again. So I made my choice. I would risk everything to build it, even if it meant losing all my savings. I called it Heartwood Village. Construction began slowly. I used what I had, called in friends, and trained volunteers. The work was endless, but my spirit grew lighter with each passing day. People started to take notice. Journalists visited. They wrote stories calling it the Carpenter's Miracle Valley. Donations trickled in, but not everyone celebrated. My siblings mocked me in our group chat again, this time calling me the Saint of Sawdust. I ignored it. One night, as I walked the unfinished paths of Heartwood, I whispered, "Alaric, I hope you're watching." And in that moment, I swear I felt a breeze move past me, like a hand resting gently on my shoulder. By spring, the Heartwood Foundation had grown into something far beyond me. Families moved into the first row of homes. Children played in the open fields. We built a small school, then a workshop where people could learn carpentry, pottery, and metalwork. Every hammer strike sounded like hope. Reporters started calling often, asking about the story behind it all. I told them the truth, that it started with a stranger's request to build a house that felt like love. One morning, a woman from a national news station visited. As I walked her through the village, she smiled and said, "Your project is touching hearts all over the country." But that same night, my brother sent me a message. "So now you're famous?" he wrote. Still pretending to be humble. I stared at the screen, then set my phone aside. I wasn't angry anymore. I just felt tired. Weeks later, I received another envelope, this one black, not brown. Inside was a single document, Certificate of Incorporation, the Heartwood Foundation. But at the bottom, under Registered Founder, was not my name. It said, Alaric Boone. I froze. The foundation I'd started, legally, already existed under his name. The address matched the land deed. Who was this man really? The next morning, I went to the local records office. I asked for any file under Alaric Boone. After searching for an hour, the clerk looked up and said, "I'm sorry, sir. There's no record of anyone by that name, ever." That night, I sat alone in the mansion, staring at the key again. If Alaric didn't exist, then whose dream was I building? A week later, a man in a dark suit arrived at the mansion. He introduced himself as Mr. Langford, a lawyer. His expression was calm, but carried weight. "Mr. Ward," he said, "I represent the estate of the late Alaric Boone. You've been named as the sole heir." I felt dizzy. "But Alaric, he can't be gone," I whispered. Mr. Langford shook his head. "He passed 6 months ago. His will was only recently processed." He handed me a thick envelope. Inside, you'll find the full contents of his estate. Everything, property, accounts, even this mansion, now belongs to you. My hands trembled. "Why me?" he wrote. The lawyer said softly, "Because he builds with the same heart I once saw in another man, a man who once saved my life." Those words hit me like thunder. After he left, I sat in the grand hall, surrounded by silence and memories I didn't yet own. I opened the letter. Alaric's handwriting flowed across the page. "Eli, I chose you because you still believe in kindness. What you build now will outlive both of us." I closed my eyes, feeling tears sting. I whispered, "Thank you," but something still didn't fit. A man who left no records, no family, and yet knew everything about mine. I decided to visit the estate's archives. As I dug through old files, I found an aged photograph tucked inside a frame. It showed 2 young soldiers standing side by side. One was unmistakably my father. The other was Alaric Boone. My breath caught as I studied the photo. The uniforms, the dirt, the faint smiles, it was from decades ago. My father looked young, strong, full of life. And Alaric stood beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder. I took the photo home that night and couldn't sleep. The next morning, I called my father. "Dad," I said carefully, "did you ever know a man named Alaric Boone?" Silence. Then a rough breath. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found a photo," I said quietly. "You and him. He's the one who left me everything." He said nothing for a long moment, then spoke softly. "That man saved my life in the war. I thought he died that day." His voice cracked. "He was my best friend." I swallowed hard. "He found me, Dad. He helped me when no one else did." The line went quiet again. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why you?" I didn't answer. I didn't know either. But deep inside, I felt the truth. Kindness circles back, even when forgotten. After that call, I sat by the mansion window for hours, thinking about everything Alaric had done. Maybe he wanted to repay my father's kindness by saving his son. And maybe, just maybe, he knew this would heal more than one heart. That night, I placed a photo in the mansion's main hall above the fireplace. Two men, two lives, connected across time by compassion. I finally understood what Alaric meant when he said, "The foundation of a home isn't concrete, it's compassion." He had built that truth into me. Rebuilding the mansion became more than just construction. It became redemption. I gathered the people I'd trained from the foundation, the same ones who had once been lost, and told them Alaric's story. "We're not just restoring a house," I said. "We're finishing a promise." They worked with passion. Every wall was polished, every corner carved with care. We built light into darkness. Months passed. By December, the mansion was reborn. The windows glowed with warmth. The wooden beams gleamed like gold, and every room seemed to hum with peace. I stood at the gate that evening, snow falling softly, and thought about my father. I decided then I would invite them all for Christmas. But this time, the invitation wouldn't come from poor Eli. It would come from someone they'd never expect. I printed gold embossed cards with the crest of the mansion and one simple message. "Your host awaits. Christmas Eve." No name, no explanation, just faith. I mailed each one to my father, my siblings, even distant relatives who had long forgotten me. When Christmas Eve came, snow fell thick and silent. From afar, I saw their cars arrive, sleek, shining, full of laughter. They joked at the gate. "Watch this be another one of Eli's charity huts." But when the iron gates swung open and the mansion appeared, tall, golden, glowing beneath the snowfall, the laughter died. My father stepped out first. His voice cracked. "Whose place is this?" I stood inside, waiting. The night of truth had finally come. The lawyer sat across from me in the mansion's old library where dust had barely settled since we started restoring the place. He opened a black folder slowly, like he was easing out a memory. "This is the last will and testament of one Mr. Alaric Boone," he said. My throat tightened. I felt the wooden key in my pocket like a hot coal. The lawyer read the words clearly and carefully, as if the room deserved that kind of respect. "To Eli Ward, I leave all that I have, trusting that he will use it to build homes of kindness." He said there were bank accounts, properties, and, most surprisingly, this estate. My hand trembled. I had expected words, but not this, not the kindness written in legal ink. When the reading finished, the room felt very small and very big at once. I knew the story had changed again. Alaric had trusted me with his legacy. I thought about him sitting in my workshop, asking for a house that felt like love. He had given me a future wrapped in paper and sealed with belief. I imagined his smile, the softness in his eyes when he talked about compassion. I wondered if he had guessed I would become more than a carpenter, that I might become a keeper of promises. After the lawyer left, I walked through the mansion alone. The echo of his voice, the hush of the room, the papers on the table, all of it felt like a hand guiding me forward. I touched the carved crest on the mantel, tracing the same symbol on my wooden key. The image of my father as a young soldier rose up in my mind, the portrait I had found earlier. Questions I could not yet answer sat with me like old friends. I realized, standing in the library, that Alaric had done something people rarely do. He had trusted a stranger with a life's worth of meaning. I breathed deep and whispered into the silence, "I will not waste this." Then I set to work again, not for fame, not for wealth, but for the promise of a kinder future. I walked the mansion room by room, touching the plaster where someone had once carved initials, pressing my palm to the banister that had been smoothed by years of hands. There above a faded mantel hung a portrait that stopped me cold. It was a photograph framed in old wood, two young men in uniform, dusty and brave. One looked exactly like my father before the years pressed into his face. The other I knew from Alaric's sketches. They stood with arms around each other like brothers. My lungs felt tight. I sat on the dusty floor and held the photograph like it might tell me a secret if I listened closely enough. The next day, I went to my father with the portrait in my hands. His voice when he answered the phone was small and startled, like someone waking from a long sleep. When I told him about the picture, the silence that followed was thick. Then the stories began, halting pieces about war, shadows, and fear, and a name he hadn't said in years: Alaric. My father told me about a rescue on a field where smoke hung like a curtain. He told me about a man who had pulled him to safety at the cost of his own future. My father had believed Alaric dead. I listened and felt an old knot of resentment and gratitude unwind. After that call, I couldn't pretend any longer that this inheritance was purely about land and money. It was about a chain of kindness stretching back through time. Alaric had been my father's friend, and in some quiet way, he was choosing to repay an old debt. I sat in the workshop late that night and imagined all the hands that had once worked beside each other, all the promises whispered in hospital tents and muddy fields. I felt both small and part of something huge. That week, I found myself working more carefully than usual. Every beam I sanded felt like I was smoothing out a memory. Every nail I hammered felt like I was putting a promise into place. The mansion was turning into a testament, not to one life, but to the ripple kindness leaves behind. I woke early and walked through the mansion before anyone else. The sunlight slanted through the new windows and lit dust into gold. I found the old butler's room and dusted off a ledger left behind. In the front, written in a careful hand, was a list of names, people who had once lived, worked, and loved here. My fingers paused over one entry: Alaric Boone, friend to many. The record was thin on details, but thick with presence. It felt like someone had been waiting to be remembered. As I kept restoring rooms, people from the Heartwood Foundation arrived to help. Faces that had once been hollow with worry now smiled while they worked. We painted, repaired stairways, hung curtains, and planted small evergreen trees along the drive. Each day, the mansion became less like a memory and more like a home. The workers told me their own stories. A woman who had learned to weld, a young man who had rebuilt his life after addiction, an old carpenter who had lost his wife. We worked with a kind of joy that was soft and urgent at once. One afternoon, while laying new floorboards in the Great Hall, I found a carved message hidden beneath an old stair. For those who give, a home will follow. It felt like Alaric's hand right there with mine. I traced the letters and smiled. The discovery lit something in me I couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or the rightness of all this work. Every evening, I wrote letters to the people I had invited to Christmas Eve. I didn't sign my name on the cards. I wanted the night to arrive without ego. I picture my father stepping onto the drive in his polished shoes, the laughter slowing, the silence breaking. I imagined him seeing light through the windows and feeling something in the chest that would not be pride alone, but a deep reopening. I kept the photograph of my father and Alaric on the mantel where I could see it while I worked. Sometimes I would just sit and look, feeling the tug of past and future mixing. The mansion was no longer a house. It was a place full of second chances. I breathed and hammered, and slowly, the estate remembered how to be alive. The day we finished restoring the grand entryway, snow began to fall for the first time that winter. It dusted the newly planted evergreens and softened the edges of the long drive. I stood at the top of the steps and watched the flakes pile on the carved crest of the gate. My heart thudded, not with fear, but with something like joy. The mansion had been healed. The Heartwood Foundation had a new home. All that remained was the night I had planned in secret, Christmas Eve. I had sent the invitations and watched as luxury cars arrived under a sky full of stars. They joked at the gate. They laughed about how ridiculous it would be to accept something from me. I saw my siblings whispering in the warmth of their coats. My father stepped out of the car, his breath making little clouds, and he looked at the mansion like a man seeing an old love resurrected. He asked under his breath, "Whose place is this?" And I could hear the confusion woven with a thread of fascination. When the gates swung wide and the long carriage drive revealed the mansion gilded by snow and light, silence stretched like a held breath. My siblings' laughter faded into the crunch of their shoes on the path. The butler, a quiet, solemn man we had welcomed back to the staff, opened the heavy, restored doors. I stood inside the hall, heart steady, hands folded. The moment my father looked up and saw me, something fragile shifted. He was the first to speak, but not the first to understand. "You built this?" he asked, voice small. I nodded and stepped down into the hall, where warmth wafted like a living thing. I could feel the eyes of my family on me, curious, doubtful, ashamed. I did not shout or boast. I let the quiet do the work. That night, as coats were taken and gloves removed, people saw the portraits on the walls, the children's drawings in frames, the small plaques that told of people helped by Heartwood. They moved through the rooms slowly, like pilgrims discovering a temple. I watched my father stand by the fireplace, his hands deep in his pockets, and felt the old man inside him begin to melt. The mansion's light held us that night. It held me. The butler greeted them with a modest bow. "Welcome to Heartwood Estate," he said, his voice polished by years of manners and the weight of the occasion. He ushered them into the great hall, where warm light wrapped every corner and portraits smiled down with quiet approval. My family's footsteps made soft rhythms on the wide plank floor. They moved from the entrance into a world I had labored to make. Chairs repaired, candles trimmed, a long table set by my hands. When I finally walked into the central room, I wore simple clothes, nothing to announce a new title, but there was a calm around me I had not known before. My father looked at me, as if he was seeing someone both familiar and new. He blinked slowly and asked, "Eli?" That single syllable held 1,000 memories. I answered by lifting my chin and stepping forward, and then for the first time in many years, we stood close enough to speak like two people, not a father and a boy under the shadow of judgment. I led them through the house, showing them rooms we had built for families, the workshop where children learned to make toys, and the small library full of donated books. I pointed to a portrait above the hearth, the photograph of a young soldier in Alaric. "He saved my dad," I said simply. My father's face crumpled, and I saw the years fall away for a moment, revealing the young man behind the stoic mask. My siblings whispered and shifted, and the old jokes died on their lips. They looked at the plaque listing donors and helpers and felt the truth sink in more slowly than I liked. I did not gloat. Instead, I invited them to sit at the table. "We eat together tonight," I said, not to prove a point, but to remember. The air was thick with something like repentance and possibility. They hesitated, then took their places. For a while, silence ruled. Then a child from the foundation came forward and thanked everyone for the food and warmth. Her words were small and honest, and they, like a crack in ice, let something warm through. My father's eyes shone wet and uncertain. I set out plates without fanfare. The moment felt healing, fragile as a seed. As we sat around the long table, I told a small story about the first toy horse my father and I made together when I was a boy. It was a quiet tale, sawdust on our knees, laughter in a workshop lit by a single lamp. I watched my father's face as I spoke, seeing the lines soften as the memory reached him. The room listened, and the hum of whispered conversation turned into something like shared remembering. My sister asked for seconds, not of food but of the story, and soon everyone spoke. My brother remembered the way our father used to whistle while he worked, and an aunt recalled a Christmas our mother baked bread that smelled like cinnamon and hope. The stories tumbled out like loose coins, easy and bright. Tears came with smiles. My father kept his hands folded, his voice unsteady when he spoke. I judge by silver, he said softly. I forgot the gold that mattered. The confession landed like a bell ringing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small wooden key Alaric had given me. I set it on the table in front of my father. This is yours, I said. You gave it to me once without knowing what it would unlock. His hands trembled as he picked it up. He looked at me the way a man looks at a map once he understands the path. Then he stood, came around the table, and hugged me without formality. The embrace cracked something open between us that had been closed for years. The room shifted. My siblings offered apologies that sounded more true than they had any right to be. We spoke late into the night about mistakes, misunderstandings, and the strange ways people can be rich and poor all at once. The words were not perfect, but they were honest, and honesty did what money never could. I felt something light move through me, a quiet relief, as if the mansion itself exhaled. When the night ended, my father stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the wooden key. He said, "You were right to build." I did not answer with pride. Instead, I said, "We were right to remember." We closed the doors behind us, but the warmth remained. I walked down the hall and touched the carved beams where 100 hands had left marks. I felt contentment gather like snow at the window. The days after that Christmas were softer. The village thrummed with life. Children learning, pottery drying, and meals shared on repaired tables. People from nearby towns visited and left inspired. The mansion had become more than a building. It was a living center where folks could learn and grow, where kindness had a physical place to rest. Donations came in modestly and steadily. New volunteers arrived, eager to be part of something that mattered. One evening, as I walked the grounds, a woman from a news outlet approached me with a camera crew. "Can we film?" she asked. "People will want to see how this miracle began." I agreed, but I insisted on showing the real parts. The small classrooms, the workshop where kids learned carpentry, the faces of people who had rebuilt their lives. The camera captured hands holding wood, smiles over tea, and an old clock ticking in a workshop where time felt like healing. Despite all this, the old sting of family judgment lingered like a shadow that refused to leave the corner of a bright room. My siblings called once in a while, sometimes with interest, sometimes with old jabs that slipped in like cracks. But the warmth I had found at Heartwood mattered more than those cracks. I welcomed their curiosity and left room for change. One afternoon, a lawyer I did not know arrived with a letter that would change everything again. The envelope bore the seal of a bank. Inside was a set of papers explaining that a secret account had been set up years ago by Alaric, funds intended to sustain the foundation he had dreamed of. The account had been nearly depleted, but the bank had matched new donations and allowed Heartwood to continue. There was no signature, only a note in familiar handwriting. "Keep building. Kindness returns." I folded the letter and kept it in the ledger. The support, quiet and unseen, proved that Alaric's influence reached further than I had known. Sometimes help comes from places you cannot name. I felt gratitude like a gentle tide, rising and steady. Winter thawed into spring, and Heartwood grew roots deep enough to weather storms. A small school had a new roof, the workshop added a bench for teaching, and more families moved into homes built by hands that once trembled but now steadied with purpose. I found that building people was different from building houses. It took patience, trust, and the willingness to start again every day. One day, a woman came to the front door of the mansion carrying a small box of old letters. She introduced herself as a distant cousin of Alaric's, someone who had been looking into family history. She had found letters indicating Alaric had served in a special unit alongside my father, and that he had kept detailed notes on acts of kindness he encountered. He believed in paying kindness forward, she said. He wrote about people he thought would carry on his work. She handed me a stack of papers filled with lists, sketches, and small maps. They read like a roadmap of compassion. As I read through the notes, I found mention of places Alaric had visited and people he had helped. There were names crossed out and names circled. My name appeared more than once, next to phrases such as carpenter with a gentle heart and teach the skills of hope. Tears came as I realized how deliberate his choices had been. Alaric had not stumbled upon me by accident. He had been watching, learning, and waiting. That evening, I placed the letters into a glass frame and hung them in the mansion's study. They were a testament to careful kindness. I also thought about my father and how a single act in a field decades ago had rippled into our lives in ways none of us could have predicted. As spring softened into summer, the Heartwood Foundation added new programs, an apprenticeship for young artisans and a therapy group for veterans. The mansion's rooms were full of life and small victories. I found myself standing in the doorway more often, thinking about the chain of people we represented, those who gave and those who received, those who forgave, and those who learned to ask for help. The seasons kept turning. Heartwood ran classes, hosted holiday meals, and became a place where neighbors brought tools and time instead of gifts. One afternoon, I was called to a small gathering in the Great Hall. The local council had arrived with a plaque to honor the foundation's work. As they unveiled it, applause filled the room, and I felt oddly embarrassed by applause I hadn't asked for. My heart belonged to the work, not to titles. Later that week, my father visited the workshop alone. He sat on a stool, watching apprentices plane wood and steady nails. I handed him a chisel, the very kind we had used when he taught me to carve a toy horse as a boy. He looked at the tool, then at me, and nodded. "You did well," he said plainly. I didn't need a speech. His quiet approval was a heavier gift than gifts piled under a tree. At night, I returned to the mansion and walked the corridors. I would sometimes stop at the portrait of my father and Alaric and whisper thanks into the frame. The legacy of two men whose lives touched so many felt enormous and right. I thought of Alaric often, how a single person can change the course of another's life by choosing to act. His faith in me had set in motion 1,000 small doings that kept growing. Everything was not perfect. Old resentments surfaced sometimes, and new problems appeared that needed solving. But the work went on because people believed in it. The Heartwood Foundation had become a place where failure was treated as a lesson and compassion was taught like a skill. One evening, as the sun set orange against the trees, my father and I sat on the back steps and watched apprentices hammer and laugh. He turned to me and asked, "Do you think he would be proud?" I looked at the workers, the families, the laughter rising like steam, and said, "I think he already is." He smiled and the lines around his eyes softened. For the first time in my life, I felt we were on the same side. News of Heartwood spread beyond our valley, and people came from far and wide to learn about our model of care. We hosted workshops on building, on community, and on the humble power of giving without applause. I often thought about the morning I answered Alaric's call, and how one question, "Can you build a house that feels like love?" had changed everything. The question had been simple, but the answer required everything I had. One afternoon, a young man who had grown up in Heartwood came to me with plans to start a similar project in a city. His face carried hope and fear in equal measures. I showed him the ledger, the letters from Alaric, and the programs we ran. Then I gave him a small wooden key, a simple token I had kept since that first sealed letter arrived at my workshop years ago. He held it like a talisman and promised he would build with heart. I realized then the key was less object and more idea, and that idea traveled when given to others. In the quiet moments, I still wrestled with questions. Why Alaric chose me, why my family once turned away, how kindness can be both fragile and overwhelming. But those questions no longer weighed like boulders. They rolled like pebbles in a stream I could navigate. I had learned to accept the mystery and focus on the work. As autumn approached, I prepared for a different kind of season. Workshops would ramp up, donors would visit, and the mansion would host new classes in music, carpentry, and seam work. The Heartwood Foundation had found its rhythm, steady, sure, and generous. That evening, I sat on my old workbench, holding the wooden key. I felt grateful for every hard moment, every laugh, every tear that had wound its way into this place. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Alaric." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like hands turning pages, and inside, the mansion breathed as if to answer. Snow fell the morning I prepared for the family's visit to Heartwood Estate. The mansion gleamed beneath the white sky, a cathedral of timber and light. I stood in the main hall, checking every candle, every polished beam. It wasn't pride that stirred in me. It was gratitude. Years ago, I had been a son too poor to host Christmas. Now, I was the man blessed enough to open a door that love had built. At sunset, headlights curved up the long drive. Luxury cars lined the entry, their engines humming like bees in winter. I waited behind the great oak doors while the butler, Mr. Avery, straightened his jacket. "Ready, sir?" he asked. I nodded. The doors opened with a sigh of hinges, and cold air swept in with my family's laughter. My brothers stepped forward first, half-smiles frozen as they looked around. My sisters whispered. Then my father appeared, slower, his gloved hand gripping his cane. His eyes roamed the chandeliers, the portraits, the polished floors. "Whose house is this?" he asked. Avery bowed slightly. "Welcome to Heartwood Estate. Your host is waiting." I stepped out from behind the staircase. Silence spilled through the hall like lights spilling from a cracked jar. "Merry Christmas," I said. No one spoke at first. My father's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Eli," he whispered, "you built this?" I nodded. "With help. With faith." He looked around again, the disbelief softening into something else. Wonder, maybe, or guilt. My siblings exchanged glances, their polished confidence crumbling at the edges. I gestured toward the dining room. "Dinner's ready. Please come in." As they followed, the great hall echoed with a hush of realization. Portraits of children and families lined the walls, each face a story of kindness. The laughter that had once mocked me was replaced by awe. For the first time in years, my father didn't lead the way. He followed. The dining room glowed with soft gold light. I had arranged everything myself. Wooden plates polished to mirror shine, candles made by the foundation's children, garlands woven from pine and ribbon. My family sat stiffly at the long table while Avery poured warm cider. The crackle of the fireplace filled the silence. I stood at the head of the table. "Before we eat," I began, "there's something I'd like to show you." On the far wall hung a portrait, the same one I had discovered in the mansion's attic. Two young soldiers, arms around each other, smiling through dirt and fatigue. I turned the frame so the firelight caught it. "You know one of them," I said quietly. My father leaned forward, his face drained of color. That can't be." "It is," I said. "You and Alaric Boone. He saved your life, didn't he?" He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I thought he died that day." "He lived," I said, "and years later, he found me. He asked me to build a house that felt like love." My father covered his mouth with his hand. "He found you," he repeated, voice breaking. "All this was him." "Partly," I said, "but mostly it was what he left behind, faith in the good he once saw in you." The words hung heavy in the warm air. My siblings looked down at their plates. Even the fire seemed to hush. "Finally," my father whispered, "I judged you by what I could see. He judged you by what you could give." I stepped closer. He said the richest man is the one who builds something others can call home. Tears blurred his eyes. He stood slowly, his hands trembling. "Son, I was wrong." I smiled. "Then tonight we start right." Outside, snow drifted against the windows like soft applause. Inside, the cracks between us began to mend. Dinner passed quietly, broken only by the clink of spoons and the hum of soft carols from the gramophone. For once, there were no sharp words, no comparisons, no hidden pride. My family listened as I told stories of Heartwood, how widows had rebuilt their lives, how children learned trades, how strangers became family. My sister asked, "You did all this alone?" I shook my head. "Never alone. People build each other." My father listened without interrupting. Every now and then, his eyes traveled to the portrait by the fire. When the plates were cleared, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photo, the same one of me as a boy with him, sanding that first toy horse. He placed it on the table between us. "You remember this?" "Every line," I said. He took a long breath. I lost myself somewhere between war and pride. I forgot what building meant. I looked at his trembling hands and felt the last of my anger fade. "You gave me the will to create, even if you didn't know it." He nodded, silent tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "Forgive me." "Already did," I said. Avery entered then, carrying a small wooden box I had prepared earlier. I handed it to my father. Inside was the same wooden key, the one that started everything. You once gave this to me without knowing what it would unlock, I said. Now I give it back. He held it tight, his knuckles white around the grain. I see now, he whispered. We were poor only in the things that mattered. The family gathered around us, the warmth of forgiveness filling the room. We stayed like that. No grand speeches, just quiet understanding. That night, Heartwood wasn't a mansion. It was a home reborn. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows and danced on the polished floor. I walked the halls barefoot, the air still scented with pine and cinnamon. My family was leaving that day, but something in them had changed. My siblings hugged me longer than usual. Their laughter no longer carried that sharp edge. Even my father's handshake had turned into an embrace. He paused at the door, the wooden key still in his hand. I'll visit again, he said. Not for show, just to help. You'll always be welcome, I told him. When their cars disappeared down the snowy road, I stood alone in the entryway, the silence thick but peaceful. Avery appeared beside me. Quite a night, sir, he said softly. Yes, I replied. A long time coming. After he left, I went to the study and sat at the desk where Alaric once wrote his letters. I opened my journal and began to write. When someone calls you poor, remember, they might only see your wallet, not your worth. The words flowed easily, as if Alaric himself guided my hand. Outside, workers from the foundation were already arriving, smiling, laughing, ready to continue building. Life didn't stop for miracles. It grew from them. I looked once more at the portrait of my father and Alaric. In their faces, I saw both history and hope. The circle had closed, yet somehow it felt like a beginning. I stepped outside, the cold biting my cheeks, and watched children building a snow fort near the gate. Their laughter rang like bells. I smiled and whispered, "This is what love builds." The mansion stood behind me, glowing in morning light, a monument not to wealth, but to redemption. The key had unlocked everything it promised, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly rich. Snow had melted into mud and then into green shoots by the time I began the next phase of Heartwood's work. The mansion was no longer only a place for celebration. It had become a hub for learning, for people to change their lives. I walked the grounds each morning and felt a steady peace. The workshops were full of students. Some were kids who had fallen through the cracks of school. Others were adults looking for a new start. I taught where I could and let others teach too. We had pottery, sewing, carpentry, and small classes on reading and math. It surprised me how quickly people's faces brightened when they learned a new skill. One afternoon, a reporter asked me, "What keeps you going?" I thought of Alaric and my father and the wooden key that had started everything. I said, "Hope is small at first, but it grows when people have a place to practice being kind." The reporter nodded and wrote it down like it mattered. It did matter. People began visiting from other towns to learn how we ran Heartwood. A young couple from the city wanted to replicate our idea in their neighborhood. I met them at the mansion and gave them time, plans, and a few hands-on lessons. They left with a wooden key I had carved for them. It felt good to give something that was more than pretty wood. It was a promise. Even so, sometimes I would sit alone in the old library and think about the chain of acts that had led here. I would touch the photograph of my father and Alaric and imagine the dusty field where one life had been given for another. I had once wanted to show my family. Now I wanted to show the world that small kindness made big things possible. We held town meetings where neighbors came to suggest programs. We voted on what new classes to offer. People from the village began to lead those classes. I watched them teach and grow proud of the change we had started. Life at Heartwood moved steadily forward like a well-built plank that does not bend. The spring festival we planned felt like the first real test of all we had built. We invited the whole valley, friends from the city, and even some reporters who had followed our story. People arrived bearing pies and quilts and stories. Children raced across the green, and adults set up stalls to sell handmade wares. The workshop's new clay pottery sold out within an hour. The sound of laughter and trade mixed together like a happy song. During the festival, a man came to me with hands full of tools. He said his factory had closed and he had nowhere to go. I offered him a bench in our metal workshop and a place to sleep until he found work. He cried quietly and hugged me like we had been family for years. That moment felt like the very heart of what we had built. Not just classes, but care. My father came to the festival and helped serve soup. He moved through the crowd slowly, but he kept smiling. He handed a bowl to an old woman who had lost her home and sat with her for a while. I watched him and felt proud. Not of him proving wrong what he said before, but proud that he had chosen a different way now. The festival also brought a surprise, a letter from a lawyer in a distant city. It said Alaric had set up a small trust long ago to help projects like ours. The lawyer asked if Heartwood would accept a modest annual sum to help continue our work. We accepted gratefully. The money was not huge, but it meant we could afford better tools, more books, and a small salary for teachers. The trust felt like another quiet hand steadying our work. I walked among the stalls, listening to stories, and I thought about the old man whose kindness had started all this. I whispered thanks into the warm air. Summer taught us a new kind of rhythm. The school added evening classes for adults. Our apprentices began to take on real commissions for homes and furniture, using profits to fund Heartwood. I would sometimes visit a family's new home and watch the children open the doors like it was Christmas every day. People who once had been ashamed to ask for help now came to teach others. It was the best kind of change, the one that keeps moving. One afternoon, Clara came to visit with news. Her company wanted to partner with Heartwood to create a program that matched young people with mentors in construction and design. The partnership sounded like the next big step. We would use the mansion's rooms for classes, and Clara's company would provide internships in city projects. It meant more students would find work and keep learning. I agreed, though part of me worried about losing the small, personal touch that made Heartwood special. Clara promised it would not change the heart of our work, and I trusted her. That week, a dispute rose up in the town about land use near Heartwood. A developer wanted to build a shopping center near our valley. People were divided. Some saw jobs, others feared losing the quiet place we had found. I spoke at a meeting and said we needed to protect what made the valley a place of calm and care. The crowd listened, and a compromise was reached. The developer would fund a community green space instead of a large mall. It felt like the valley had chosen kindness too. At night, I walked the mansion grounds with my father. He told stories I had never heard. His fears in quiet years, the friends he missed, the nights he had thought he had failed us. I listened and offered what I could, a hand, a laugh, a shared memory. The work was never just wood and nails. It was hearts being rebuilt. By the autumn of that year, Heartwood had grown into a small network. Other towns called, asking how to start their own places. I began traveling for talks, but I always returned home in time to teach a class or fix a broken chair. Travel taught me that the thing we built was not unique because of the building. It was unique because of the way people saw each other. I tried to share that idea over and over until it felt like a song I could hum in my sleep. One evening, a woman from a foundation visited with a grant offer to expand our veteran programs. She had heard about the workshop where veterans learned carpentry and used it to heal. She wanted to fund a counselor and more materials. The grant would allow us to hire a trained therapist to work with veterans. The thought of that made me breathe deep. I knew how silence could eat at a person. The chance to help others find words and rest felt like a sacred duty. That winter we planned a new project, a traveling workshop on wheels that would bring skills to people who could not reach Heartwood. We converted a van with benches and tools, stocked it with wood and clay, and taught basic skills to nearby villages. The van became a small beacon. Kids waved as it passed, and adults asked when it would return. It was slow work, but it planted seeds of hope far beyond our valley. Through it all, my father's presence at Heartwood grew steady. Sometimes he would sit and listen to veterans share stories. He would offer a quiet word that had weight because it came late and true. I saw him age and soften, and I felt the circle close in a way both gentle and right. One spring morning, an old woman named Marta came to the gate with a letter she had kept for years. She had been a friend of Alaric's long ago and had kept a small box of mementos. And it was a note Alaric had written to himself, Find the hands that build without asking, and give them the key. Marta had kept the box waiting for the right time. She handed it to me with trembling hands. The note made tears come quick and warm. She also told another story, how Alaric had once saved a small village from losing their school by paying for roof repairs in secret. He did not want thanks. He wanted the good to keep going. Marta said he always believed that if you gave in secret, the good would find its way back. I held the note close like a small map to follow. The more I learned about Alaric, the more his quiet faith became a part of me. That summer, a young apprentice from Heartwood announced he wanted to start his own workshop in the city. He was nervous but brave. I gave him tools and a list of contacts, and I felt that familiar tug in my chest, the same I felt when Clara first offered me work. Letting people go was part of what we taught, to build and then to give away what they had learned. The apprentice wrote from the city months later, telling me he had a tiny shop and had taken on his first paid job. His letter ended with, "I carry the key." My chest warmed. The Heartwood Foundation had become a place where people left stronger than they arrived. The mansion had become a quiet witness to this change. I still wondered, some nights, how one man's quiet kindness had started a chain that warmed so many hearts. But the answer felt simple. Alaric chose to trust a stranger and left instructions not to stop. By late autumn, Heartwood hosted its third annual gathering. People came from farther away now, carrying stories and questions. We gathered in the great hall beneath the portrait of my father and Alaric. I spoke about what we had learned, that building a life for others was the best way to build your own. I told them about the van, the village projects, and how small acts add up to a powerful change. People listened and clapped, and some cried. I felt proud, but also humble. After the speech, a woman approached me with an envelope. Inside was a note and a small photograph of a young man in uniform I did not recognize. The note read, "To the family he helped save." On the back, written in a shaky hand, were words, "Thank you, Eli. Because you built what I could not, my grandson found peace." Tears blurred the photo. More people came with letters and small tokens, things Alaric had once given or kept. Each item tied another loose end of the story together. It felt like finishing a long, careful quilt. That night, as lamplight warmed the hall and children chased each other between tables, my father came to stand beside me. He did not say much. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed. "You did well," he said simply. Those words were small and vast at the same time. I thought of Alaric and the way his kindness had rippled through years. I tucked the thought away like a precious tool. I walked outside into the crisp air and watched the sky. The mansion stood behind me, lights soft and steady. I realized that Heartwood would not always need me to hold it up. It had become something people owned together. I felt a quiet joy. The key that had started it all rested in my pocket, worn smooth by years of handling. It was beautiful because it had traveled so far and unlocked more than just doors. It unlocked people. The next Christmas arrived brighter than any before. The snow came early, soft and steady, blanketing the roofs of Heartwood Village in quiet white. Inside the mansion, the smell of cinnamon and pine filled every hallway. This year, the celebration wasn't just for my family. It was for everyone who had helped build this dream. I set long tables in the great hall, lined with candles and simple garlands made by the children. The walls were covered with drawings, handprints, and thank you notes from families who had found new lives here. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of heart. People came carrying homemade pies, toys, and warm blankets. We had more laughter than we could count. My father arrived early. He no longer wore the heavy coat of pride he once did. Instead, he helped carry food to the tables and greeted every guest like an old friend. Watching him move through the crowd made me smile. He had changed, not by speeches, but by grace. When dinner began, I stood at the front and raised a glass. "Tonight," I said, "we start a new tradition. Each year, every family here will choose one person outside these walls, a stranger, to bless in secret. No names, no thanks, just love passed forward." The hall filled with murmurs of agreement. A few children clapped. My father nodded quietly, tears in his eyes. After dinner, We sang carols while the fire crackled. The youngest child placed a small wooden heart at the base of the great tree and whispered for the next home. It felt like a promise. Later, as I walked outside under the falling snow, I looked at the lights glowing through the mansion windows. Years ago, I'd been told I was too poor to host Christmas. Now, the whole valley gathered under one roof. And somehow I knew Alaric was here too, smiling in every warm light. Spring returned with new beginnings. Hartwood's gardens burst with color, roses, tulips, and rows of young oaks planted by volunteers. The mansion had become more than a symbol. It was a heartbeat that reached far beyond the valley. People called it the Mansion of Hearts. I spent most mornings teaching apprentices in the workshop that once fit only one man and his tools. Now it buzzed with energy, hammers tapping, saws humming, laughter echoing through the beams. Above the entrance hung a carved sign that read, "Love is the strongest foundation." One day, as I polished a small rocking horse, I realized how much life had changed. Years ago, I had carved toys out of sorrow. Now I carved them out of joy. The difference was everything. A group of children from the city visited the estate that month. I watched them explore the gardens, touch the smooth wood of benches, and stare at the great heart emblem on the front gates. One little girl asked, "Did you really build all this?" I smiled. Not alone. A lot of kind hands help. She nodded seriously. Then I want to build too. That small sentence stayed with me. It was the echo of what Alaric had taught me. That kindness keeps building if we let it. My father began leading storytelling nights for the families. He spoke softly about war, loss, and the miracles that grow from small acts of courage. People listened in silence, some with tears, others with smiles. I saw him healed by the telling. Every season brought new projects, new faces, new hearts ready to learn. I walked through the mansion one evening, touching the wood panels still warm from the day's sun, and felt Alaric's presence in every grain. He had asked for a house that felt like love. Together, we had built a whole world that did. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, old friend. Your key opened more than doors, it opened us." The wind moved through the pines like a gentle reply. Time moved softly at Hartwood. Each year, the estate became brighter, the laughter fuller, the circle wider. Families came and went, but love never left. The mansion had become a home not for one family, but for hundreds. That winter, I decided to restore my old workshop, the same shed where the story began. It still stood behind the small house where I once sanded the wooden angel in silence. The walls were worn, the windows clouded, but stepping inside felt like meeting an old friend. I ran my hands over the bench where I first carved hope out of wood and pain. We rebuilt the shed as a training center for young artisans. The old sign above the door now read, "Hartwood Workshop, where hands learn to heal." On the opening day, I stood beside my father as children filed in, holding their first pieces of wood. The sound of their tools filled the air like music. "This is where it started," I told him. He smiled. "And where it keeps starting." I nodded. He was right. The work never truly ended. It simply passed from hand to hand. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the quiet workshop. The tools hung neatly, the floor swept clean, but I left one small space untouched. The spot where that first wooden angel once rested. I placed a new angel there, carved by one of the children. Its wings were open, its face simple and kind. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the mansion. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the stars through the old window pane. My heart was full, not of pride, but of peace. The boy who once built to forget pain had become the man who built to share love. The wood creaked softly beneath me, as if the workshop itself whispered, "Well done." Years have passed since that night, when my family arrived at the gates of Hartwood. The mansion still stands beneath the pine-covered hills, its windows glowing warm every evening. Children still run through the courtyard, and families still gather for Christmas. I walk slower now, but my heart moves lighter than ever. Every Christmas Eve, we light a single lantern at the highest tower window. Its glow spreads across the valley, a signal of kindness that never dies. People from nearby towns pause to watch it. Some say it feels like Alaric's spirit watching over us. I like to believe that's true. My father sits near the fireplace each winter, telling new generations the story of a carpenter who once built a house that felt like love. He doesn't call it my story anymore. He calls it ours. I still keep the wooden key on my desk. Its edges are worn smooth from the years, but the heart symbol is clear as ever. Sometimes I let visitors hold it, and I tell them what Alaric told me. The foundation of a home isn't concrete, it's compassion. People often ask if I ever got over being called too poor to host Christmas. I smile and tell them the truth. I didn't get over it. I built something better because of it. When I walk through Heartwood's halls at night, the sound of laughter and music fills the air. I stop by the portrait of Alaric and my father and whisper, "We did it." If there's one lesson my life has taught me, it's this. When someone calls you poor, they're only measuring the wrong thing. They see your wallet, not your worth. True wealth isn't what you own. It's what you build in others. And sometimes, that's the mansion they'll never forget. Please subscribe and share for more interesting true life stories.